Okay, good morning, everybody, and welcome to Wednesday morning's seminar. Today we are looking at compensation events, and this is being led by Richard Silver, Senior Partner at Silver Law. As always, Richard is delighted to answer questions live this morning, but if there's something you'd like to ask and don't wish to ask in an open forum, please feel free to email him directly, Richard Silver at silverlawllp.com. Otherwise, if you're happy to ask your questions today, please use the Q&A or chat facility in the bottom toolbar there, and Richard will address these questions from you at the end. So without any further ado, Richard, I'll hand over to you.
Good morning, Julie. Good morning, all. Today we're going to be looking at compensation events under the NEC form of contract and comparing them with the procedures that are under JCT for relevant events, relevant matters, stroke variations. You will be aware that I am a panel adjudicator, an arbitrator, mediator, and also a party representative. And I've been involved in only a few disputes really under the NEC, not that many, but where there has been a dispute, it's a big one. It might seem strange, but from my experience, parties who are involved on the NEC form of contract sign up the contract and then more often than not put that contract in the drawer and then almost act as if they're under a JCT form of contract or one of the ICE forms. They don't generally follow the NEC contract. And when I'm giving lectures face-to-face, quite often a few people put their hands up and start to argue with me, brave people. But when we actually go through and say, do you do this? They say no. And do you do this? No. And in the end, you find out they're not following the contract and they have to admit they are following some completely different provisions. And many people, although this form of contract is meant to be very easily written and understood, more often than not, it isn't understood. And the reason for that is that we've all been involved in JCT contracts for many, many years. We've gained our knowledge and understanding of them. But the NEC remains a relatively new form of contract. It isn't used that often, and its terminology is so different to what it was traditionally under the JCT and the ICE that people just don't actually accept what it says and follow other provisions. And we're going to try and identify those differences and what the problems are to give a clear picture of how the NEC ought to work. Now, the starting point is that under the NEC, we have this term compensation events. And a compensation event is an event which provides compensation to the contractor. It is an event which gives the contractor three things. It gives the contractor additional time. It gives them an entitlement to be paid for any change to the works information, in other words, a variation. And it also gives them potentially, in effect, loss and expense or damages caused by the event. And it's all wrapped up into one. So we don't have this situation where we've got to deal with an extension of time and separately loss and expense and separately variations. We only have one thing, a compensation event. That is it. And under the NEC, there is a whole list of compensation events, albeit that in theory, the employer can add or omit to those events. And depending upon the option, there will be additional events. So, for example, where we've got a B of Q, there will be compensation events for errors in that B of Q as to quantity. And equally, where maybe the description is wrong, and that will also constitute a compensation event. Now, that's particular to the options with B of Q. But there are options for adding further compensation events, or dare I say it, in option Z, there is options for deleting some of those compensation events. And indeed, that quite often happens. So do be aware, option Z is an opportunity for the employer to amend the contract. And it will come as no surprise that option Z is often very long. And if there are amendments, in my experience, it's not generally for the contractor's benefit, it is generally for the employer's benefit, where the employer is increasing the risk of the contractor by placing further obligations on the contractor and or by deleting certain of the compensation events, and also by adding in additional obligations as to procedures, again, increasing the risk on the contractor. So be aware, do read option Z. In the NEC, we have a whole lot of compensation event items. They're not always as easy as one would like to understand. You know, there is no clause that says variations. We have changes to the works information. The works information is what the contractor has to complete. And if there are changes to that works information, then that is a compensation event. Now, the works information where there is a design obligation upon the contractor will be separated into two parts. And it will depend, therefore, where the change is. I think one other vitally important factor is many of the compensation events are linked to the program. And indeed, those events arguably won't work unless there is an accepted program. So an event that often is a delay is late information. If the employer / project manager does not issue information or instructions in due time, that's likely to cause delay. So the question is when does that information have to be issued? And it's linked to the program. If the PM does not provide something by the date shown on the accepted program. So if you have no accepted program, you have no baseline under which to judge when information was to be given. Similarly, access is linked to the program, as are other compensation events. So I cannot overstress the importance that there is an accepted program. But that creates a problem, because to get an accepted program, there's two things required. Number one is that the contractor must have submitted a program that is compliant. And number two is that the project manager must have accepted that program. And it's my experience that all too often does not happen. Now I'm going to expand upon that slightly, in that we're not talking about just simply one program. We're talking at the very least a program every month. Because under this contract, we have an accepted program, and a revised program has to be issued at the dates stipulated in the contract data. And that is more often than not every month. But in addition to that, the contractor has to issue programs where progress on site is not following the current program, or when the project manager instructs him to, or when the contractor chooses to, or, and each and every time the contractor seeks to issue a compensation event quotation, that quotation he is saying is delaying the works should also include a program. Where we've got an activity schedule and the contractor wants to increase the number of items on the activity schedule, then that program must match that activity schedule. Now, just deal with that. On the activity schedule, the contractor is paid when those activities are completed. So if he has one activity, groundworks, he doesn't get paid anything until those groundworks are completed. That's obviously going to be no good. So he's got to break all the activities down, which means each time he breaks down an activity, he's got to produce a new program. Now that program in itself is not simply a program. It is a more onerous program, I suggest, than most contractors issue under JCT. It must have things like critical path and float and the like. But it also includes method statements, health and safety risk analysis, and lots of other things like method statements. So we've got a huge amount of information that the contractor has to issue. And it's my experience more often than not that if the project manager really wants to be difficult, I think you can find almost a reason for rejecting in each and every program, because it is so onerous on the contractor to provide the program that matches with the contract requirements. But even where the contractor submits a program in the required format, I very rarely, if at all, ever see it accepted by the project manager. So we're working from a contract that provides a baseline for assessing extensions of time, and relevant events, relevant matters, variations, in other words, a compensation event, which is based upon dates not being met in an accepted program where there is no accepted program. And you can see what is going to be the problem. You're not going to get agreement. The job progresses on with ever-growing list of alleged compensation events by the contractor, not agreed by the project manager, an ever-growing dispute and disparity between what is being applied for and what is being paid. Now, my experience is that at the end, there's a horse deal. And provided that horse deal works out and everybody's happy, no problem. And everybody says, NEC, what a marvellous contract. Everything went to plan. Well, it didn't go as the contract intended, but ultimately it was resolved and the parties are happy. But where it doesn't get resolved, you end up with this whole big dispute. And more often than not, neither party has followed the contract, and that thereby creates a bigger problem in each party seeking to defend their position. The project manager will say that the contractor has failed to issue all the relevant notices, they haven't submitted compliant quotations, etc., etc. But then the contractor will say, well, neither of you, Mr. Project Manager, you've done exactly the same. You haven't issued the notices you should have done. You haven't submitted the quotations or valuations, assessments of compensations. You haven't done what you should have done. And we have this big, big problem. Under the JCT, and I imagine most of you have experience on that, we don't have that nature of problem. Under the JCT, we have a separation between what are variations and are simply to be valued in accordance with the contract. We generally have a ladder of events or methods of valuing. So if we've got a BOQ, use the BOQ. There's no rates in the BOQ, you pro rata. If you can't pro rata, you establish a fair rate. If you can't do a fair rate, it may be day works. So there's a set down method of evaluating. There is provision for the submission of quotations and acceptance by the architect, CA, project manager, employer's agent. But occasionally it works, but more often variations are valued after the event on the basis of a fair value. And you quite often find when the final account comes about, the contractor will have 60% of the values agreed. There is agreements as to whether or not they are variations and how you're going to value them. If there is a dispute, you're getting involved in fair values, not really into contractual entitlement and obligations, but just simply is it a variation or what's a fair value? Unlike NEC, we're going to get into much wider arguments. We then have relevant events. And under the JCT, we have relevant events and relevant matters. And let me just really impress upon people these two clauses are not linked. Quite often people think because many of the relevant matters mirror the relevant events, they are linked, these clauses, but they're not. So you should be dealing with these clauses separately. So if you're issuing a notice under a relevant event, that's under one clause. You must issue a separate notice under the relevant matter. They are differing obligations. The next thing is that the fact you have a relevant event or not does not mean you have no relevant matter. And normally people sort of stand up and look at me and say, what? This is news to me. But let me just give you a really simple example. We are carrying out works on a contract where it is a refurbishment project. And we've got major works internally and minor works externally. And the minor works, let's say, are just pointing. And they are not on the critical path. And there is a set quantity of pointing works. And lo and behold, the employer under a JCT instructs a whole load of additional pointing. And in areas that were not covered before, and which involve quite a lot of loss and expense. Because what we've got to do is we've got to bring on an extra foreman to oversee this works. We've got to bring in additional scaffolding, possibly. There may be other problems. We've got to do lighting because it's going to be done in the evening. We're going to bring in lots of additional preliminary works that may cause a problem. They may indeed say that the works have only got to be carried out in certain hours because of danger to those people in the location, lots of different factors. But we look at it and it simply is not going to delay the works because it is external works which is off the critical path. And therefore, there is no entitlement to extension of time. But there most definitely is entitlement to loss and expense. And indeed, if you look at the variation clause under the JCT, it expressly provides for the valuation of loss and expense as part of a variation. It is my experience that contractors all too often price the loss and expense separately rather than much better and easily to do in the variations. Because if you're pricing the loss and expense as part of the variations, you're dealing with cause and effect. That's the way you should be doing it. Now, it will come as no surprise that quite often the PQS says, well, no, don't do that. Let's agree the variations and put the loss and expense to the side, and we'll deal with that separately. Now, if I'm a contractor, I'm going to say, no, the contract provides here that you value the loss and expense as part of the variation, and that's exactly what I'm going to do. You only pick up the loss and expense as a relevant matter separately where you cannot recover it anywhere else. And I can recover it somewhere else. I can recover it as part of the variation. So do be aware, relevant events and relevant matters are not linked, which goes to one further point. As far as I'm concerned, if the employer issues me a relevant event for exceptionally adverse weather conditions, but I think that he's covering himself because he doesn't want to issue for variations. Being honest, I'm not bothered because the reason the relevant event is issued, an extension of time, is to get rid of the damages for that period of time. I've been awarded 10 weeks extension of time. You now cannot claim 10 weeks liquidated damages. But I can still recover the relevant matter, loss and expense, because provided I can show that but for the event, I would have not incurred this cost, I can recover it. So the fact again that the works were, let's give you again my refurbishment works, and let's say this time that the situation is that we have two critical paths, the external works, which is critical, and the internal works, which is not. And there's loads of additional works in the variations, other matters internally. The fact he's awarded me an extension of time for exceptionally adverse weather conditions does not mean I can't recover prolongation costs associated with the internal works, because but for the internal works, all these resources would not have been on site. So, mindful of that. Do be aware, relevant events and extension of time will be support of entitlement to loss and expense, but does not mean you're not entitled to recover it where it's a neutral event. As far as the JCT events, you will all know the list of relevant events, and you'll also know the list of relevant matters. You will see that there are certain items that are relevant events which are not relevant matters, or otherwise known as neutral events. That is quite different to the situation that it happens under the NEC. As we've identified under the NEC, unless the contract is amended, all events give the contractor potentially time and money. Under the JCT, certain events give them time, but no money. And a prime example is weather. Under the JCT, the contractor will get an extension of time, but will not get money. Whereas under the NEC, he will get both. And the reason the JCT can do this is because they are neutral events. In other words, they are not events for which the employer is responsible. For any event that an employer is responsible, the contract must provide for the recovery of loss and or expense or damages because the employer is in effect in breach. So by issuing instructions and variations, the employer is preventing the contractor completing on time. That is a breach. By failing to give access to the works, that again is a breach by the employer. It's an act of prevention. By issuing information late, that is a breach. But the fact the weather is terrible, that's not the employer's fault. They're not in breach. and therefore the contract can provide for any events for which the contractor, the employer, is not responsible, does not necessarily have to include for loss and expense. Other examples would include antiquities, statutory undertakings. Those events are not for which the employer is responsible, so in theory there does not have to be any relevant matter. Now, as we've identified, there is also differences in the JCT on the way that certain of these events are dealt with. Under the NEC, we have a clause 60.119. It is a sort of save-all clause, and it is an event where neither the employer nor the contractor could have prevented the event. And at the time I underline this, at the date of the contract, the risk was so small that it would have been unreasonable for the contractor to allow for it. Now, if you are of January of last year, no one knew of COVID. Neither party could have prevented it. And at that time, it would have been seen as such a small risk that on that basis, it would be a compensation. If you look at it today, yes, neither party could have prevented it. But as of today, everybody knew it's a huge risk. And hence, it would not be a compensation event today, because at the time the contract was entered into, both parties were aware of the risk. That situation should also be considered with the specified perils, leaks and fires. Dealing with leaks and fires, is it the possibility that the contractor could have foreseen it or could have prevented it? Because if that's the case, they're not going to get a compensation event for it. Whereas under the JCT, it's very simple. If there is a if there is a fire or a leak, the contractor does get an extension of time. We have two options. We have it where it is a refurbishment project and the employer will take out the insurance, or where it's new build, the contractor takes out the insurance. But both of them provide for an extension of time. And in the standard form, you could argue, well, why was there a big leak? Well, there was obviously some negligence by the contractor, but nevertheless, because it's covered by the insurance, the contractor does get extension of time. And where the insurance has been taken out by the employer, it's treated as a variation, and the contractor can get loss and expense. Where the insurance is in place by the contractor, he obviously recovers the money from the insurance. The next one is ground conditions. Now, this is somewhat different under the JCT and NEC because of the nature of the works. Now, we must remember the new engineering contract is, as the second word indicates, an engineering contract. JCT is a very traditional building contract. And engineering contracts quite often involve substantial works in the ground, JCT less so. So matching the old ICE forms, under the NEC, we have provisions for unforeseen ground conditions. So if it can be shown that at the time, again, when entering into the contract, the contractor, based upon the information that is available, that it was unexpected and it was such a small risk that the contractor should not have allowed for it, then it constitutes a compensation event. And it would be based upon the information that's provided by the employer to the contractor in the site information. You're going to look at any SOAR reports or other information that the contractor should have taken into account. In some ways, the more information the employer provides, the more easy it is able to show that the contractor would not have allowed for it because it isn't in that information. But what the contractor has to show is two things, is that first of all, he was unaware of it and that it had such a small chance of occurring, it would have been unreasonable for him to allow for it. Under the JCT, it is unlikely that the contractor is going to have any entitlement. Now, let's just deal with that. Obviously, where there is no design and build, and we've got situations where the works are in the B&Q, if that change of work changes because of unforeseen ground conditions, obviously it's going to be a variation. What we're really looking here is the design and build situation. Now, the contractor has to design the foundations and he takes on all risk. And if he finds the conditions are not what is expected, he has no claim. However, if the employer includes within the documents soil reports and or other information pertaining to the ground conditions and they are wrong, then there is errors and discrepancies in the ERs, and the contractor would be able to claim a change to the employer's requirements. It's because of that that quite often, whilst the employer issues soil reports and the like at tender stage, they are not contract documents. The reason is the employer is trying to get away from being in breach of contract. You cannot be a breach. There cannot be an error in documents in the contract if those documents are not contract documents. So that's why they're often issued not as a contract document. But the employer can still have a liability for misrepresentation. The employer has issued something to the contractor upon which the contractor has relied and which has been found to be wrong. That is misrepresentation, for which the contractor can claim damages. Now, to trying to get around that, what quite often happens is that there is an exclusion clause at the back of the soil report saying the contractor should not rely upon it. But there is a case, Bakel, where it was identified that in order to be able to rely upon this exclusion clause, it must be brought to the attention of the contractor. They must be able to easily see it and find it. The more onerous the clause or the limitation exclusion clause sought to be imposed upon the contractor, the more this exclusion clause must be brought to the reasonable attention to the contractor. And although it's not a construction case, it is a case called Horseshoe Lane Car Park, which related to a sign saying that you leave your cars here at your own risk. But the sign was at the car park at the back, and it wasn't brought to the reasonable attention to people who park their cars and held was not enforceable. That's why you see all of these notes now where you have to pay. The next one is adverse weather conditions. Now, under the NEC, in theory, it looks like it's fairly easy to be administered. We have in the contract data, details of the weather element that is to be monitored, be it rain, be it wind, be it temperature or otherwise. And what you need to show that this event has occurred less than once in the last 10 years. So that's quite a high burden to meet. Because if one looks at, weather conditions over the last few years, they've been fairly exceptional. And therefore it is very difficult to actually work out whether you've met that criteria. But as soon as you have tick box, it is a compensation event, and then you make your quotation. And do remember, your quotation is meant to be done as foreseeable, what you foresee. Now, I see that it's a bit strange under the NEC. How can you foresee something when it's weather which has already happened? So again, there seems to be a slight mismatch there. So I don't really see how you can, in many ways, do a quotation, because it's always going to be after the event. And the project manager, if they've got any sense, will be monitoring what has actually occurred and therefore assess the compensation event based upon that. This is what has actually occurred, and therefore this is your actual entitlement. Under the JCT, we have a different situation. We have exceptionally adverse weather conditions. So it has to be exceptional, and quite often what they will look at is, again, meteorological results. But it's not necessarily saying that it's every 1 in 10 years. Now, quite often there is an amendment into the contract to make it 1 in every 10 years, but in the standard form, it is exceptional. I would still say 3 out of 10 was exceptional. The next thing is the fact that there has been exceptionally adverse weather conditions does not mean it is a relevant event or relevant matter. You then need to jump the next hurdle, is to show that it actually caused a delay. Without showing that, you have no entitlement. So you could have had terrible weather, but if you're doing internal works, what difference does it make? NEC is not like that. You don't need to prove it. It is or it is not an event. But under the JCT, you have to actually show it caused delay. Ultimately, it's my experience that whilst the way the clauses are drafted in the two forms are different, they are approached in exactly the same manner in reality. Both under the JCT and the PM, the CA or the PM, both look to establish, based upon Met records, what the weather is, whether it has been exceptional, and what is the actual delay that has been caused. Obviously, under the NEC, we then go a step further to actually assess what is the financial effect in valuing the compensation events, whereas under the JCT, we don't get anything. One huge difference between the two forms is the notification requirements. Under the JCT, we do not have to, in theory, notify of variations. You get an instruction or you get a drawing, you don't have to notify that this is a variation to the contract, you simply value it. But under the NEC, where there is a change to the works information, in theory, the compensation of the contractor is obliged to notify the PM where the PM has not notified in the first instance. Now, let me just emphasize this because all too often it doesn't happen. For each and every instruction issued by the PM, which constitutes a change to the works information, the project manager is obliged to issue an early warning notice and a compensation event notice and a request for a quotation from the contractor. I'm going to go through this again because it does not happen. So you issue an instruction. PM should also issue an early warning notice because it is likely that this compensation event, this instruction, will increase the total of the prices. There's likely to be a value. So you should be issuing an early warning notice. It's also likely or possibly to cause delay. You should be issuing an early warning notice. The fact that it is a change to the works information, you should also be issuing a compensation event notice. And in view that you have now notified that it is a compensation event notice, you should also be instructing the contractor to submit a quotation. But all too often it does not happen. And upon such basis, the contractor, where the PM has failed to issue a compensation event notice or a early warning notice, the contractor has to do it. So be aware. Now, as far as those notices are concerned, there is a possibility that if the contractor fails to issue either an early warning notice or a compensation event notice, their entitlement may be reduced or indeed lost. I'm going to say that again. You do not issue certain notices under the NEC, you could totally lose your entitlement. Now, let's deal first of all with an early warning notice. The NEC provides that when assessing compensation events, if the contractor has failed to issue an early warning notice, the event should be assessed on the basis that he did issue the notice. Really strange wording. So, where a contractor has failed to issue an early warning notice, the compensation event is to be assessed as if he did issue the early warning notice. What does that mean? Well, let's give an example. We've got this instruction today, or there's been an event or a problem with access or something else, which is clearly a compensation event. There's late information, but the contractor does not issue an early warning notice, and as a consequence, the project manager is not warned. The project manager is unaware of this problem, and a couple of weeks go by before the project manager becomes aware. Having now become aware, he issues the relevant information, he sorts out the problem, and the contractor now can progress. But there has been a 2-week delay because the project manager was unaware. The compensation event is now assessed as if the contractor had given the warning. So that if he had have given the warning when he should have done, that 2-week delay could have been avoided. So in other words, that 2 weeks delay is lost. So the contractor's entitlement will be reduced where he has failed to issue an early warning notice. And if that early warning notice had been issued on time, the PM could have mitigated delay that was incurred. The second notice requirement that is of the utmost importance, and possibly even more than the early warning notice, is the compensation event notice. And the contractor now has to issue that notice within 8 weeks of becoming aware that the event has occurred, has happened. Now that is different to the NEC 3. So as soon as it is happened and he's aware of it, then he's got 8 weeks. Now, there are arguments of whether the contractor was in fact aware. So the event could have happened, but he was unaware. So there is arguments of whether or not when the clock still ticks, because it is a subjective test, not an objective test. But the big issue is, does that mean for all events, if the contractor fails to issue a compensation event within 8 weeks, does he lose his entitlement? A very interesting question. In answer to that, in the notes, which we'll come to in a moment, I was an adjudicator in a matter where this particular issue arose. It is one of the later slides. It is Healthy Buildings versus the Northern Ireland Housing Executive. And what this involved was surveys in regards to the existence of asbestos in ceilings in existing buildings. And the consultant had been instructed to do certain forms of testing. What then happened was that at a site meeting, the project manager stated, and which was recorded in the minutes of the meeting, which was subsequently issued, that the relevant code of practice that was required to be met was revised and changed. And what this meant was that further tests were required to be undertaken, because under, if I remember rightly, the original code of practice, if you found in 10 buildings and you went into the first one and they all built roughly the same time, the first ceiling had asbestos, you could assume that the others had it. Whereas under this other code of practice, you could not do that. So effectively, the contractor, because of this request to meet a different code of practice in the site meeting minutes, was now required to carry out a lot of extra work. The contractor didn't pick this up, didn't issue a compensation event notice, and didn't submit quotations. Equally, the PM, other than recording it in the meeting minutes, didn't issue an instruction, early warning notice, compensation event notice, or anything. As the job progressed, some 6 months later, the contractor, the consultant, picked up that they were doing all this additional work and sought compensation events and applied for all of this amount of extra money, which was quite substantial in view of the size of the project. The project manager, the employer, denied the contractor had any entitlement. They had, in their arguments, not issued any instruction. But even if they had, the contractor had not notified it within 8 weeks. As I say, I was the adjudicator. And the first thing I decided is that because the project manager had confirmed what was required to be done, and that had been recorded in the minutes, this constituted an instruction. It was in a form that could be read, copied, and recorded, and it did constitute a change to the works information. So as far as I was concerned, it was a compensation event. But then the second hurdle was required to be met. Had they notified within 8 weeks? And the situation, they most definitely had not. 8 weeks had long gone and no compensation event notice had been issued by either party. So on that basis, the employer said, well, they've got no entitlement. Unfortunately for the employer, I didn't agree. And I said, well, no, because this is a change to the works information, the project manager was obliged to issue a compensation event notice and had not. And under such situation, the 8 weeks did not become relevant because it says that the 8 weeks requirement is only required to be met if the PM is obliged to issue the event notice and had not. And that was the exact situation we were in. So I found that they didn't fall because of this condition precedent notice, and hence they were entitled to a compensation event and all the money. Unsurprisingly, the Northern Ireland Health Executive did not agree, and there were thereafter 2 legal cases. And I'm very pleased to say the court said I was right, and healthy buildings were paid, Northern Ireland Executive lost, and it was held that the 8 weeks requirement to issue the notice did not apply in relation to changes to the works information. Under the JCT situation, the issue of notices is often one that is disputed, but the situation is relatively clear. Under the JCT, a contractor is still entitled to extensions of time, even when they have not issued a notice of extension of time. The JCT says that 12 weeks after practical completion, whether the contractor has issued an extension of time notice or not, the architect, the employer's agent, shall consider what further entitlement to extensions of time the contractor has. In other words, the architect, CA, employer's agent must consider 12 weeks after PC what entitlement to extension time the contractor has, irrespective of whether a notice has been issued. So far as loss and expense is concerned, it's less clear. But the case law says that in order for a clause to be a condition precedent, it must be clear. And what it must state is when exactly the contractor is obliged to issue the notice. The JCT does, and it says that you have to issue the notice as soon as it becomes reasonably apparent. It doesn't stipulate it shall be issued within 7 days or 8 weeks in the NEC. And as a consequence, under the JCT, the failure to issue a loss and expense notice does not prevent the contractor from recovering loss and expense. Slightly in the wrong place, there is the Northern Ireland Healthy Executive versus Healthy Buildings, the case I dealt with before. So consideration. Number 1 is NEC is not the JCT. When you sign an NEC contract, do not think you are under JCT. Do not try and deal with a global claim because you cannot succeed. Under NEC, all your loss and expense must be allocated to the compensation event. The only way for you getting additional time and additional money is in the assessment of the compensation event. There is no other way. Under the NEC, unlike the JCT, the issue of notices are extremely relevant. You issue or fail to issue an early warning notice, your entitlement will be reduced. Fail to issue a compensation event, you may lose your full entitlement, save for where it is a change to the works information. We have more events under the NEC. We have both relevant events and relevant matters. So I think your entitlement can be much greater. The other thing is we're doing assessments based upon quotations and what we foresee the delay will be. So you can make a quotation that means you actually recover more than you actually incur, or less. You can lose money. You can submit quotation for compensation events that are wrong and thereby lose money. You assess the delay is 6 weeks and it proves to be 10, hard luck. You assess it to be 6 weeks and it's only 3 weeks, well done. Indeed, when we're assessing extensions of time, it is the difference between the last accepted program and the current accepted program. So if we're on a contract of 60 weeks and our current accepted program shows us completed in 50 weeks, and then there's a compensation event which gives us a revised completion date of 60 weeks, we get a 10-week extension of time, even though in theory we're not delayed, and we get 10 weeks worth of prolongation costs. It is completely different from the JCT. So be aware. Okay, covered a lot of information in a relatively short period. Julie, are there any questions?
Yes, there are indeed. Bear with me one moment. First question, under option E, there is a lot of confusion repayment. Please can you confirm the understanding that implemented CE only adjusts budget as it would adjust target under option D, and E, payment is still made based on actual defined cost, unlike option A, where implemented CE creates an agreed lump sum?
A lot of questions in there. Yeah, I think what that person is saying is effectively correct. Yes. What we've got to recognise is what is being paid in interim applications is different to what is ultimately being paid, let's use the terminology, within the final account. Where you've got targets, the contractor is paid what they've actually incurred, their actual cost, their defined cost, and then the total of the prices, the actual end value, is assessed at completion. So let's just give an example. The contractor is paid what they've incurred, it's 10 million. They then work out what is the value when we take into account all the compensation events, and it's worked out the actual value is 9 million. The contractor has effectively been overpaid and has to repay money. So you're paid as the job progresses based upon what is the cost. That's the same under option E as well. If that person wants to send me an email, I can probably clarify in more details. It's a bit difficult in the limited time that we've got.
Okay. Next up is someone who's disagreeing with you, which is always an interesting event.
Right person.
You say that discovery of antiquities is a neutral event for which the employer is not responsible. I take a different view. When an employer buys a site, he chooses where the works are to be built. If he selects a position where there is archaeology, he, more than the contractor, has responsibility for the effects of his choice.
Okay, let's give a nice simple example. This gentleman or lady's mother, little old lady, has just bought a site. She's bought, or it's not even bought, so she's been living in her house for the last 50 years. As an 80-year-old woman who's bought a house with no idea that there's antiquities or anything in the ground, nor does she know that there is speckled newts in the garden. She's got no idea. She then calls this builder who's been in the business for many, many years, who turns up on site and says, "Hello, love. Yeah, of course, happy to build your extension on the back of the garden. It's 20 grand. She says, "Okay, thank you very much. I'd love you to proceed." He then starts digging up and says, "Hold on, love. Did you know you've got speckled newts and you've now got a number of graves here, antiquities that neither you nor I knew about, but you're going to have to pay me £200 million worth of money because of the delays incurred." Oh, no, he doesn't. He had no idea. She had no idea, so she's not responsible. It may be a different situation if the employer knew or should have known of these ruins, but if they do not know, then how can they ever be held responsible? It is a neutral event, and if you look under JCT, if it was not a neutral event, the JCT have been drafting their contracts wrong for the last 50 years, because under the JCT, it is a neutral event.
Okay.
I'll probably put off anybody else asking me questions.
And anyone who wants to know about newts or antiquities. Okay, regarding misrepresentation of information provided by the employer, which turns out to be incorrect and relied upon, my main contract lists the employer's works information as the contractor's works information, and therefore under the contract, the employer would not appear to have provided any documents. I assume misrepresentation cannot be relied upon in this case.
No, not right, but you're looking at a different sort. There's two questions here sort of added in together that don't quite match. Under the NEC and JCT, JCT design and build, we have the employer's requirements of the contractor's proposals. It is not uncommon, and I would suggest it is actually common, that the contract has been amended to the effect that the contractor takes responsibility for the employer's requirements. And therefore, if there is any design in those works that are wrong, it's the contractor's problem, even though the contractor didn't do it. So let's give an example. The employer goes off and gets an architect. They get the employer's requirements put together, and included within those employer's requirements is all the steel work and everything else, and also the site layout and the site boundaries. And all of that is wrong. The contract provides that the contractor takes responsibility for all that information. It's now the contractor's problem, hard luck. But that's got nothing to do with misrepresentation. Misrepresentation is a non-contractual action. It's a tortious action where a party has a duty of care to the other party when providing certain information, but it has to be read in all the circumstances. So where an employer is issued a SAW report, which is not a contract document, as part of the tender documents, in pricing, the contractor takes it into account. And if it's proved to be wrong, there's a misrepresentation, which the contractor may have an entitlement. But we're not talking about a contractual entitlement. And what that individual is talking about is a contractual situation where it's part of the contractual documents. So there wouldn't be a right for misrepresentation because there isn't any misrepresentation. What the contract says is this is the employer requirements. We're not representing it's right or otherwise. What we're saying is this is the base design. What you now need to do is to develop and complete that design, and which would include any errors in that design.
Okay. Next question up. Notification of the project manager's failure to reply. Does the notification need to say anything specific to be deemed effective?
It just needs to be clear and expressed under that provisional provision. I don't think you necessarily have to state under clause 60, whatever it is. What you need to state is we submitted quotation. I mean, we've got two ones. One in regards to whether an event is or is not a compensation event, and one is whether or not a quotation has been accepted. So what I would suggest is something along the lines of an instruction was issued on such and such a date. By such and such a date, we advise that this was a compensation event. You have failed to respond within the period of whatever many weeks it is. And as such, we hereby give you notice that should you not respond within the next 2 weeks, this will be deemed a compensation event. Now, you might not want to put it quite so formally because let's be honest, you're going to try and get away with it so that the PM doesn't notice, but it needs to say words to that effect.
Okay. Someone is asking here, what is the case name regarding the 8-week notification of CE period?
I'm guessing they're talking about the case about whether the 8 weeks applied or not. It's in the back of the notes. It's, oops, wrong way. Is that one?
Okay, so that's Northern Ireland Housing Executive versus Healthy Buildings. Okay.
Brilliant adjudicator on that one. He was really clever.
Familiar, I believe. Okay, someone else is asking, can you expand on the level of proof required under clause 60.1 to demonstrate it was indeed a prevention event?
Well, what you first of all need to establish is that the particular event has occurred. So that's number one. So what is the event? And without more detail, I don't know. So an event has occurred. So let's just give an example. So in January of last year, we've signed this contract. Thereafter, immediately COVID hit. So the first thing is, as of January of last year, we didn't know anything really about COVID. There had been a couple of bits on the news that there was this problem in China, but everybody, including the government in the UK, no one was concerned. So we were slightly aware of it, but there's nothing I as a contractor could do, and there's nothing that the employer could do of the effects that COVID has now had, and neither of us knew it was a problem. So we've now met that requirement. If you were doing this today, you've just entered into a contract today, and you argue down the line, COVID's really had an problem because there's been another wave, hard luck, because whilst neither you nor the employer could have done anything to prevent it, you're both aware of it. We both know today that COVID is not going to be going away anytime soon, and therefore you would lose your entitlement.
Okay. Next up is the difficulty with the time bar is that the obligation for a contractor to notify is where the contractor believes the event is a compensation event, which may be difficult to assess for some events, such as physical conditions or weather measurements. There is always the if in doubt, notify anyway, but this seems to water down the contract procedure.
Totally agree. Whoever said this, let me just be clear, and I'm sorry if the ICE are online, but I think there are a number of faults in this contract, and that's one of them. This whole obligation of issuing notices isn't, in my view, very good. And I think that is just one example. I believe there are many more. I mean, if you are to follow this contract to the word, on any decent sized project with a normal amount of changes, there should be notices every day. And how can you, foresee a delay for weather when the weather has actually occurred? The delay is today. Now, it may have impact in the future, a flood, or some major problem caused by rain, could have not only the delay today whilst we can't work, but it could cause damage that cause further delay in the future. But more often than not, the delay is today and tomorrow when the weather occurred. So you've then got X amount of weeks to submit your quotation. Well, it's happened now. But equally, we're looking at that the weather condition should be less than 1 in 10 years. Well, when are you going to find that out? If it's how much rain it's concerned, it's only when all the rain's occurred. Or when all, the winds. How often does this happen? Well, at the moment we're on, there's been 10 of these, and in the past, we've had 10 occur twice in 10 years. It's all after the event. So I don't think the notice requirements always work, and therefore I totally agree with this individual's criticism of this form. It is not a perfect form. There is no perfect form out there. All forms, in my view, ought to be amended because they are not drafted for your particular job.
Okay. Right, the final one is someone's asking, could you just clarify the notification requirements for loss and expense under JCT?
Dear sir, please be advised that the regular progress of the works has been delayed by the following event: the late issue of information. As further particularised in our letter of the 1st of yesterday, we set down the full particulars of the relevant event, when information was required, when it was issued, and what was the knock-on effect. You will see from this notice that we've identified there was a 3-week delay during the period from here to here, and which will have a consequent knock-on delay to the completion of the works. By reason of this delay, it is the case that we will need to retain on site our full site setup, and furthermore, there has been disruption caused to labour resources. We would also advise that because of all this additional work and disruption, we've had to deploy to site additional resources to undertake the works. All my love, the contractor. That would be more than sufficient. It would be useful to put behind it. The following is an approximate assessment at the moment. But you've now notified, you've told them what the event is, you've told them basically what the costs will be, what the nature of costs that are going to be incurred and why. That would suffice. What contractors all too often do is they issue a relevant event notice like this, which is inadequate. Dear sir, we hereby notify you under clause that we have been delayed by reason of one of the following relevant events. They then list every one. At the moment, we cannot assess what will be the delay to completion, but you have our assurances that we will make out every effort to mitigate such delay. Whilst writing, we're also like to be incurring loss and expense for which we will seek recovery. Lots of people are now going, how did you know that? That's in our file. That is rubbish. The person who is going to be assessing your entitlement extension of time should know what's going on. Yes, he does, because he's probably caused it. And he's going to want to prove that it wasn't him. He's not going to want to give you an extension of time and have a PI claim against him. So when you're writing a relevant event notice, pretend you're issuing it to your mum. Your mum should look at it and be able to go, I understand everything. I can't deny it. So you should be saying in an extension of time notice, dear sir, we hereby advise you that we're being delayed by reason of the late issue of information, this being a relevant event. In accordance with our construction programme, activity 1, piling, was due to start on the 1st of January. 2 weeks before, we asked for relevant information as per our request for information sheet number 13, where we set down in full detail the information that we required. Unfortunately, this information was not forthcoming, and as a consequence, this has caused a delay. The information was finally issued 7 days late, upon which we were then able to return with the rig and to carry out the works. This ultimately caused a delay of 2 weeks, being from January the 1st to January the 15th, and caused a consequential similar delay to completion. There's your extension time notice, and then your loss and expense should refer back to your extension time and set down what is the impact upon resources.
Okay. So you've just made yourself immensely popular with everyone that's listening's mum, as they become bombarded with emails from everyone saying, do you understand this, mum? And if they do, then yes, it's good to use. Okay, that appears to be the end of the questions for today. So thank you very much, as always, for your time, Richard, and answering all those questions. Thank you to everyone for attending. We are next back online with you next week. Wednesday morning is JCT Design and Build Standard Form. If you'd like a place on that, please email seminars@silverllp.com. And as we said earlier, if there's anything specific you wanted to ask Richard but didn't want to ask in an open forum, it is Richard Silver, thank you Richard, at silverllp.com. He'll be delighted to assist as soon as you email him. Right, without any further ado, thank you very much, Richard. Enjoy the rest of your day. Everyone else, enjoy your day, and we will see you all again soon. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.